Weary Dunlop's standout feature for me was an extraordinary combination of both moral courage and physical strength.
Yeah.
Weary Dunlop loses it and says, men are risking their lives to keep you alive. We built up this system. We've gone to such effort. If you keep pulling that out, you will not only die like a yellow rat, you will deserve to die like a yellow rat.
I'm Andrew Rule. This is Life and Crimes, and today is a red letter day. We are honoured to have a guest on the show. Peter FitzSimons is one of the biggest names in Australian journalism and in writing a series of books that have sold by the truckload. He's good at it. He's a good bloke. He talks well, and he's going to tell us about the latest of his long line of bestsellers, and it concerns a great Australian, the late Weary Dunlop. This week, Peter, you're going to tell us all about Weary Dunlop, the great hero, the great war hero. But next week, you're going to tell us about a very dark chapter that involves Weary Dunlop, where his best man, the best man at his wedding, was murdered. Is that roughly right, Peter?
Well, I'll tell you what, I like the introduction about me. That was good.
Yeah.
That's absolutely right. No, you're more than kind, Andrew. Thank you. And it's nice to connect because I've read your stuff for years and listened to you, of course, on this mighty podcast. Look, the Weary Dunlop story, I suppose I connected with Weary Dunlop and recognised the name from very early on, both because both my parents served in the Second World War.
Yeah.
Dad was at El Alamein and the Battle of Milne Bay and Finchhaven and Dumpu.
Yeah.
Mum was a nurse / physio, putting those soldiers together. So I had, the name resonated.
Yeah.
And also I was fascinated that Weary Dunlop was a wallaby. So I was in the Wallabies for about 5 minutes, but just enough to get my papers stamped.
Yeah.
But Weary Dunlop, I know the Wallabies of my generation had talked about Weary Dunlop because he turned up in the dressing room one time in a game that they played, I think, in Victoria. And so I'd always known the name. My publishers came to me in late 90s and said, you've got to do this book. I resisted. And then a couple of years ago, I began. And if I may say, whatever people think about how I've done the story, the story of his life is staggering. Unbelievable what he accomplished.
Was he as good a rugby player, a sportsman, as he was at everything else? He clearly was a superior piece of gear.
I suspect he was not particularly skilled because how could he be skilled when the 16th game of rugby he played was in the Wallabies? So for whatever skills I got, I started when I was 11 years old and refined them over the next 13 years before I got into the Wallabies. So when I was briefly in the Wallabies, I was 6'6", which is 2 metres tall in the old money. And I was big. I was a big man in the Wallabies in the 1980s, early 90s. Dunlop started out in 1932. And he was 6'4". I think that's about 195 centimetres.
Yes.
And he was famous for the fact after his first game, they said, well, where did your strength come from? And he said, on the farm in Benalla, I could hold 2 wheat bags, each weighing 212 pounds, one in each arm. And he said, but that's nothing. There's a bloke at home that can hold another one with his teeth. So he can hold. He was probably gilding the lily.
Possibly.
He was physically strong, and at that point, he was already studying medicine. So when I hit blokes, I aimed to hit him just under the ribs. He aimed to hit him on the gallbladder.
Oh, did he? He knew a little bit about anatomy. And
that's it.
He was such a brilliant child. He was a kid on the farm up there. He could have ended up, being a good farmer or a bad farmer or anything else. But he was always very clever, ambitious, and hardworking, wasn't he?
He had an elder brother, and the original idea was that his brother was so smart, he'd go away. They couldn't afford much to educate them, but they'd put it into the older brother, and Weary would stay on the farm. But then one of the teachers, I think at Benalla High, took his father aside and his mother and said, look, your son is seriously gifted. You've really got to keep going with his education because who knows what he might become. And from there, he got an apprenticeship with a local pharmacist, did so well. He then got a scholarship to study medicine. He went to Ormond College, the famous Ormond College at the University of Melbourne, did brilliantly well. And then just on spec, as Banjo Patterson might have it in one of his famous poems,
Yep.
Clancy at the Overflow.
Yep.
He wrote away, he applied for a scholarship to the Royal College of Surgeons in London, and you were not meant to apply for this until you'd actually got your medical degree. He did it beforehand. He was so brilliant in sitting the exam that he won a scholarship. So not long after he'd fallen in love with a beautiful young woman by the name of Helen, who lived in Toorak Road, Toorak,
Yep.
and was a very high class, well above him.
Yep.
He goes away to England and lands in England in 1937 to study surgery. And while he's there, he's playing rugby. He's already played 9 matches for the Wallabies, and he'd had to decline going on a 6-month tour of South Africa. In my day, you'd go away on a 6-week tour.
Yeah.
You'd fly somewhere, and probably, in fact, it wasn't even as much as 6 weeks, 4 or 5 weeks. But in his day, you'd have to get on a ship and be on a ship for a month or
Yeah.
two before going. And because of his medical studies, he'd had to stand down from the tour of South Africa. But he was still in that vein. He plays rugby in England, but mostly he studies to become a surgeon. And then, of course, the Second World War breaks out, which is where he made his true fame.
Yeah, that's what most people know about him. Where did he start his rugby? Was it at university?
At university, he was rooming with a bloke from Queensland.
Yep.
And he was playing Aussie rules. And this bloke in Ormond College looked at Weary and goes, 6'4", 17 stone, mate, you're born to play rugby. So his first game was with the university fourth 15.
Yep.
After the first game, they put him in the third 15. Then they put him in the second 15, then the first 15. And he's so good and so strong that he was picked to play for the Australian University side, which is a famous side
Yep.
made up of the best universities. He then played, I think from there, played against the touring All Blacks, and then from there makes his way into the Test team.
I see. Well, it's a fabled rise, but in his case, eclipsed by his other achievements and the fact he survived the war and did unbelievable things during the war. I know what he did during the war has impressed you all over again because you've been through it line by line. What stands out for you about his war service, and where did it take him?
Look, you and I, Andrew, we have written about heroes in our time, and I have often wondered like you look at I don't know if you've wondered, but how do you reckon you'd go in the trenches at Gallipoli? I'd like to think that when the shells were landing and the bullets were flying, I'd like to think I'd be the calm, courageous, brave one working out what to do, where to go, how to do it. I have a sneaking suspicion I might be the bloke weeping at the bottom of the trench.
Exactly.
I don't know, but I have a feeling that might be me. And my previous book, Albert Jacka, VC, also from Victoria, he was a bloke who had a preternatural calm when the bullets started to fly, knew what to do and how to do it, and he rose accordingly. Weary Dunlop's standout feature for me was an extraordinary combination of both moral courage and physical strength.
Yeah.
That he first finds himself, he goes to Tobruk, and he's a very well-educated man. He'd been in the militia back in Victoria, so he comes in with the rank of captain, and he's in charge of sorting out the hospitals in Jerusalem and in the Middle East before the first troops arrive for the Second World War. He lands in Tobruk, and because he's got such ability, they keep wanting him to be administrative, and he keeps saying, I don't want to be an administrative colonel or captain. I want to refine my skills, my medical skills. I want to bring them to the service of the men. And his particular passion was to form a mobile hospital so that when men got injured out on the front, it wasn't putting them on stretchers and bringing them back to Weary. Weary wanted a mobile hospital wherever the bullets are flying. Let me get there with my hospital. We'll set up in 45 minutes. We'll be operating 32 minutes after that. We'll have all the material with us and we can save lives.
Yep.
And so he did that. He was brilliant in Tobruk, and I've written a book on Tobruk, The Rats of Tobruk.
Yeah.
So it's not a bad thing on a man's resume to say he was a rat of Tobruk. Then you get what happened in Greece, where, I was staggered by this in previous books, that you had 27 German divisions invading Greece. Churchill had a treaty with Greece which said, if Britain's attacked, Greece will help. If Greece is attacked, Britain will help.
Yeah.
So when Greece was attacked, who did Churchill send in? The poor bastards of the Australian divisions.
Yeah.
They were the ones that got sent, and they were completely overwhelmed, outnumbered. Weary was there on the front. He gets away from, he is able to escape. He gets to Crete. He gets back to Jerusalem. They're there. He's setting up his mobile hospital. Then the word comes, basically, the Japanese have dropped the bombs on Pearl Harbor. There's a danger that Australia is going to be invaded. There's the famous battle between our Prime Minister, John Curtin, and the British Prime Minister, Churchill, as while the troops, which were including my father, were on the high seas. Do they come home to Australia, or do they divert to Burma to thwart the Japanese westward thrust towards India? And Churchill insisted they go to Burma in the service of the British Empire.
Right.
It was our guy Curtin who said the famous line. He said, I dare say there are many places where Australian troops can be of great service in this war, but nowhere will they be of such great service as in the defence of Australia. Weary Dunlop, who was on the Orcadus, one of the fastest ships, they are indeed diverted, not to Burma. They land on what we know as Indonesia, then the Dutch East Indies. They are there in he's there in what we know as Jakarta, then known as Batavia, and the Japanese invade. He gets up into the highlands looking after a hospital. In that hospital at that time, one of the most powerful stories in the book. Yeah, they've got all prisoners that have been wounded. These are these allies that have been wounded. One of them was a bloke by the name of Bill Griffiths.
Yes,
and he'd been made by the Japanese to crawl through a minefield. One of the mines had exploded, had taken out both of his eyes, 2 hands, 1 leg, and he's there in the hospital bed when the Japanese arrive. The Japanese officer barks these orders, obviously in Japanese, to one of the soldiers, basically saying, "Kill him. We're not wasting any time, any resource on that." Weary, in not the first, but one of the most famous, legendary displays of his courage, stands in front of the Japanese soldier, and he says, makes it clear, he says, any bayonet that goes through this man will have to go through me first. Right. The Japanese back off. He saves his life. And at this point, the Australians are then taken prisoner. Weary has a natural leadership. So the usual rule with combat soldiers, if you're in an Australian combat unit, is that the commanding officer will be a combat officer. Yeah. Weary was not a combat officer, he was a medical officer. And the men wanted him to be their commanding officer, and even his fellow officers wanted him to be the commanding officer. So he was able to, using his medical skills, his leadership skills, while they were in Japanese POW camps in the Dutch East Indies, keep them alive, and then finally the Japanese say, all right, we want you on the Thai-Burma Railway. So to get there, they go through the infamous Changi prison camp. So he's only there for 2 weeks. Then they go to Thailand, and that's when they find themselves on the shocking Thai-Burma Railway.
Yes. That is where the legend really kicks in. Yeah. Because Australians have heard of his bravery and his efforts to save fellow Australians and others under terrible duress.
One of the things I try to do in my books, Andrew, I'm sure you try to do in yours, but I don't fancy myself as an historian. I'm not an expert. What I try to do in my books is to use my ignorance as a tool. So when I first started doing, the first huge book I did was on the Kokoda track. And for all my sins, I didn't know how many men were in a platoon, how many were in a company, how many were in a battalion. So when I do my books, I try to work in explanations so the reader can follow what's happening. And so I don't know if you know, but I certainly didn't know much about what the Thai-Burma Railway was about, why the Japanese wanted to do it. And the answer is the Japanese invaded Southeast Asia. They wanted a Japanese economic prosperity sphere. It's an extraordinary story, but basically the Japanese had seen Asia colonized by the white man.
Yeah.
And by the 1930s, going into the 1940s, they were basically, well, we're not going to do that anymore. If there's going to be any colonization going on, well,
we'll
it's the Japanese that should be in command here. So one of the things they wanted was the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, which was India. They wanted to get their forces, their material, their resources towards India. How do you get it through Thailand and Burma? You've got to build a railway. So they more or less drew a line across the map, straight through the jungle, straight through the mountains. And they said, how are we going to build it? And they used, now this word is no longer kosher, and you wouldn't use this word. There are words that go out, but they were known at the time as coolies, Coolies.
Yep.
And these were brave, strong men and women, but Asian men and women that were paid just about nothing, given appalling, treated in absolutely appalling manner, and bolstering their forces were the POWs from England, from Canada, from America, from Australia. So Weary was in charge of Dunlop Force. They were given a part of the Thai-Burma Railway to build. They march out into the jungle, appalling conditions, not enough food, shocking heat, shocking humidity, shocking malaria. And Weary's in charge of keeping these men alive with very limited resources. And one of the things that I found absolutely inspirational in the book is he said, we are Australians. What do we Australians do well? We look after each other very well, and we're all equal, not only under the Southern Cross, but we're all equal under the Thailand sun.
Yes.
And one of his POWs was the famous Tom Uren, who became a very famous Labor parliamentarian. Briefly, I think, became Deputy Prime Minister.
Yeah, he did, Heavyweight boxer in his youth.
That's right, and a rugby league player for Manly.
Yep.
And Tom Uren became a parliamentarian, I think, 1956, and in his maiden speech said, basically, all I am, all I represent, I learned from Weary Dunlop, the way he ran us on the Thai-Burma Railway. And he told the story how on one side of a creek on the Thai-Burma Railway, the Australians had set up their camp, and on the other side of the creek, the Brits set up their camp. And initially, I think there were 600 in both camps. And he told the story that they had a small stipend, a small amount of money under the Geneva Convention in return for working. Weary got all the officers together and said, all of you will contribute 3/4 of the stipend you get. We're going to put it in a common pool of money, and that money will be used to buy food from the local traders so that we can get papaya, so we can get bananas, so we can get rice, so we can keep the men alive. Some of the officers, and one in particular, protested and said, I need this money for when I get back to Australia. I don't want to be a part of this. This is not fair. We've earned this money. We're officers. We should get more money than the men. Weary, 6'4", and capable of brawling with the All Blacks, said very strongly, I don't think you heard me. Okay? This is what we are going to do. This is how we are going to do it. So it was where Australians, we keep each other alive. And it's not that the officers get the best of everything. It will be, in this outfit, the strong will look after the weak. And when the strong get weaker, we will still have the less weak will look after the very weak. Yeah. And so Tom Uren, in his maiden speech, said, on our side of the river, on our side of the creek, food was shared equally, the tents were shared equally, medical care went to those who were the most ill, not to those who were the most senior. Yeah. And he said, we looked at the other side of the creek, 600 of them marched in. 6 weeks later, 550 of them were dead. There were just 50 left. And it was a really sort of inspirational thing. And I don't know, reading this stuff, the Weary Dunlop, I always thought the finest Australian I'd ever written about was the late great Sir John Monash. Yes. Great Melburnian, Victorian. Yep. But I must say, Weary Dunlop, when you see that kind of stuff and the way he did it, it was just fantastic the way he did it. And so the great concern that Weary Dunlop had as the conditions worsened and the monsoon season arrived. So not only do they have this crippling heat or lack of food. I mean, they were down to 2 small pannikins filled with rice a day. So can you imagine you and I trying to do work, with that. And they were doing a cutting, the Hellfire Pass, infamous cutting. I went there in February of this year, and I'm now 64 years old, but I'm fairly fit and I'm fairly strong. And before I went to Hellfire Pass from the memorial centre there, I suppose it was 3 or 4 kilometres away, they said, now make sure you take a lot of water and you have a good hat because, it's pretty hairy out there. And sort of me going, yeah, thanks. I didn't really take their warnings seriously. I just about fainted. Like when I had to stop frequently, sit under a tree, just because it was so hot. The sun didn't shine. It beat down. And what they did was called hammer and tap. The hammer and tap method was I've got the sledgehammer, you hold it against the side of the mountain, I'm going to belt it. And every time after I belt it, you turn it a little bit to grind it, to get the dust out. Then we'll pour water down it and get it out. I'll belt it again. And you do that, and you start at 7 o'clock in the morning.
Oh, no.
In the worst of it, they put lanterns up, they put fires up at night so that there was still, they were doing it 24/7. You'd go in various shifts. But what Weary was most afraid of was cholera.
Hi, it's Gary Jubilant here. Do you want a real and raw look inside the world of crime? Well then check out my podcast, I Catch Killers, where I interview people from all sides of the law.
I draw my firearm and I went into fight mode. I wanted to find and confront this gunman.
I'm not getting verbaled, am I?
I shouldn't have trusted you. See, I'm trying to open my mind up to defence powers.
I know, it's just begging to be said.
Yeah, fair call. We have amazing guests every week. Search for I Catch Killers wherever you get your podcasts.
Before I began this book, I never quite understood cholera.
Yeah.
But the essence of cholera, it comes from, I'll use the medical term, fecal matter.
Yes.
Bodily ablutions in water, getting it in a part of the system.
Yeah.
And if I were to get cholera and you were my doctor, you would say, quickly put a dog tag round FitzSimons' neck.
Yeah.
Why? Because right now I look like me. Within 4 hours of me getting cholera, every orifice in your body expels everything, and in 4 hours I would be a sack of skin, unrecognisable from what I was. And Weary, when cholera hit on the 8th of June 1943, he quickly establishes what became known as Cholera Gulch, which was an encampment on the edge, well away from the rest of the soldiers, so that the cholera couldn't spread easily. And it was hell on earth. They put up the funeral piers, the cremation piers, about 100 yards away. So you've got the lanterns in the tent. You've got men expelling everything that got in them. And with extraordinary innovation, these doctors, the way they were able to adapt without proper medical facilities, one of the things they did in the case of cholera was the only way to keep someone alive was to get a saline solution into their body. And so the way they did it, they got 44-gallon drums.
Yeah.
They put huge fires underneath them. They put pressure on top. So the steam has to come out, a tube, which they got from abandoned Japanese lorries.
Yeah.
The tube filled with steam, they put through these bamboo-filled vats of cold water to condense it. And then to get it into your body, they used sharpened bamboo cannulas, which, very sharpened needles, if you like, which was very painful. And you'd have the saline solution dripping into their body to try to keep them alive. And the most moving episode in the book that I just love, I love it as an episode, I don't love the horror of it, but one of the things they noticed as these men are dying is that it was frequently men in their 40s, mature men with families, that were better able to cope with the horror of having cholera. And it was frequently the younger men that struggled most. And one of the stories, two of the stories I've got in the book, is that there was a young fellow, and he married in Melbourne, and at 4 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon, at 7 p.m. that night, they rounded him up and put him on the ship to go to Singapore, which fell, and then he found himself in Changi, and now he found himself in the Thai-Burma Railway with cholera. And he had not even been able to consummate the marriage, and he had heard that his bride was seriously ill. He'd got a letter in the POW camp to say she's seriously ill. He wasn't sure if he was now a widower, and he gets cholera. And they do the system. They put the cannula into his veins, in his arm, and he keeps pulling it out. And Weary keeps putting it back in, and he pulls it out. Finally, Weary Dunlop loses it and says, "Men are risking their lives to keep you alive. We built up this system where we've gone to such effort. We've stolen things to build it. If you keep pulling that out, you will not only die like a yellow rat, you will deserve to die like a yellow rat." And the guy, by the account that I've used, looks Weary in the eye, deliberately pulls out the cannula and says to Weary, I want to be with my mother, and rolls over. And Weary Dunlop loses it, has lost, and says to him, "That's all right, settle back, you'll be with in your mother in a couple of hours." And he dies. Yeah. Meantime, this guy called Scotty, and there's a fellow called Ray Parkin who did
Yes, I know of Ray, yeah.
Amazing man.
Amazing man.
On the Perth when it sank and finished up on the Tyburn Railway.
Yeah.
And I love this bloke, Scotty, and I wish I could find out what his last name was and know more about him. And I guess it's possible somebody will read my book and say Scotty was my grandfather. But this guy, Scotty, he's 42 years old, father of 3 children, and he's got cholera and he's crook. And he's in Cholera Gulch, and men are expelling fluids, expelling excreta, everything. It's madness and the lanterns, and they have to use a certain triage where if there's 20 men in the tent and we've only got resources for 15 men to keep them alive, every now and then you have to say, listen, this guy, we're not going to be able to keep him alive. He's going to die anyway. They'd say, Weary'd give the nod, put him over there on that table. So anyway, Scotty's is so crook. Weary gives the nod, put him over there on the table. He'll die very shortly. Anyway, the first time they put Scotty over there, Scotty says, "I know what you're doing, you bastards. You're wasting your time. I'm going to live. I'm going to get back to Victoria. I'm going to see my kids. I'll live." And sure enough, 12 hours later, against all odds, he's still alive. So they bring him back into the main tent. 12 hours later, this time he is so crook. Weary gives the nod again. This time he says, I still know what you're doing, you bastard. I told you I'm going to... And it happens the third time. Yeah. By this time, he can barely speak, but he just gets it out. I'm going to live. I'm not going to die. And against all odds, he not only survived that burst of cholera, he survived the entire war, got back to Melbourne, lived the rest of his life with his wife and 3 children. I love those kind of stories.
Oh, wonderful, yes.
Where you've got these heroism, and people say, why do you do so many war stories? And one of the reasons is, one reason, I think it makes me feel close to my late parents because they served in the war. But I think when you're dealing with such life and death matters, it is so compelling that you just get absorbed in it. And I say, if anybody knows that story which originally came from Ray Parkin's diaries,
yes,
I'd love to know more about Scotty.
Oh, yeah, wonderful stuff. The late John Clark introduced me to the Ray Parkin story. Parkin was still alive back in, 25 years ago, I think. And in fact, Clark would lean on all his friends and contemporaries and associates to buy Parkin's wonderful book. He did the great big book about Captain Cook's boat, I think, was it? The bark Endeavour. And this gorgeous piece of draftsmanship.
Yes.
It's a big, fat, heavy book. I paid something like $250 for it at John Clark's urging in order to support Ray Parkin. And I gave it to a friend who loves boats.
Yes, he was a brilliant one when he was in these POW camps.
Yeah.
He was a brilliant illustrator, and he loved drawing ships and the like of it. And there were others in that. One was a fellow called Jack Chalker. And when these men would get these shocking ulcers, these tropical ulcers that you'd get a scratch, and a normal healthy person, I don't understand the medical part of the antibodies or whatever, but it would heal in the tropics for seriously malnourished men.
Yep.
It just got bigger and bigger and bigger, and half the leg would be eaten away. And they got some of these fellows that were brilliant painters and artists to draw what these ulcers look like and some of the other medical conditions. And they wanted documentation. One of the reasons was, this is what the Japanese did to us. This is how we were treated, and so that they would have a record after the war
Yes.
of what had happened. And one of the stories that comes to me, and I hope I'm not getting mixed up because I finished writing this book 8 months ago, but I think it was Ray Parkin when he finally got back to Melbourne in 45. His wife has had a sort of a surprise party for him. He comes through the door of his home and there's all the neighbours and the people there welcoming him home, but he's sort of so shocked to see a birthday cake. He hasn't seen a birthday cake. He hasn't had coffee. He hasn't had tea. At one point, he's so overwhelmed that he takes a seat on the lounge and finds himself next to the local baker. And the baker starts telling him about the horrors of what it was like to be in Melbourne during the Second World War. And he said, "You have no idea. We just couldn't get enough butter. We could not get enough bread." But to go back to the Thai-Burma Railway, when the part of the book you've read, have you come across, again, what I think is the best story in the whole book of Yi Hak Nay, the lizard?
I have briefly, and I think what you're going to tell our listeners, as you will in detail, is that this man with that odd name was known as the lizard. He was a Korean, ethnic Korean. He was a very feared and hated guard.
To use the technical term, he was an absolute bastard. He was a bastard to the men.
Yeah, and cruel. He would beat them. He'd do nothing was beyond him.
That's right. And so the Japanese used Koreans. They had occupied Korea, and I think they occupied maybe 25 years before the Second World War. They'd been there a long time. And the guards were brutes by nature, but they were on the Thai-Burma Railway.
Yep.
And this fellow, Yi Hak Nay, Weary, just hated him, because one of the things was, the Japanese would say, by the time Dunlop Force, by the time all the soldiers arrived and they're doing the Thai-Burma Railway and they've got to get through the cutting by a certain point, or they've got to lay down the railway track, tomorrow we need 700 men to go out to work. Weary would say, well, there's only 500 fit to work. The rest of them are in the hospital. They're too sick. They're too malnourished. You've beaten them to a pulp. Some of them are dying. Some of them got malaria. Some of them got cholera. The Japanese would say, we need 700 men. Okay, so, and they would force desperately sick men to go out to work. And the worst of the guards that were doing it was this fellow, the lizard. They called him Lizard, Yi Hak Nay, the Korean guard. And at one point, Weary who of course as a doctor had taken the Hippocratic Oath.
Yeah.
He was so infuriated that he decided, I'm going to kill him. I am going to kill this man. This man is responsible for the deaths of dozens of my fellow Australians. I don't know who they'll replace Yi Hak Nay with, but there is no way known he'll be a bigger bastard than the lizard. So he knows a particular path that Yi Hak Nay is going to be walking on just after the sun goes down. So he goes out with a big hardwood club and waits in the jungle for Yi Hak Nay to walk by. And the red mist has descended, the red mist of absolute fury. And at this point, over the distant camp loudspeakers, he hears the voice, Colonel Dunlop, and it's the Japanese calling for him to come because a senior Japanese officer is there, is wanting to see him. And suddenly, Weary Dunlop comes to himself, what am I doing? I'm a doctor. I have taken the Hippocratic Oath, and even in those Thai-Burma Railway, if there was a sick Japanese soldier or officer, and they were more sick than the Australian soldiers or officers, he would do his best. The Hippocratic Oath, without fear or favour, you keep as many people alive as you possibly can.
Yep.
So he is haunted by it the rest of his life, that he nearly killed a man deliberately. After the war was over, do these criminal investigations, war crimes.
Yes.
And one of the names that comes up is Yi Hak Nay, and Weary, still haunted by what has happened, refuses to cooperate, basically lets it go. And he later hears that Yi Hak Nay has been executed and, basically thinks, and rightly so, for what he did, but at least Weary didn't have it on his conscience that he had been responsible for his death and hears that he's executed. Weary comes back, and we're skipping a long way ahead, but while I'm telling this story, Weary comes back to Australia, becomes one of the most celebrated Australians there ever was, and marries Helen, raises 2 sons, and then becomes an advocate for POWs, continues his surgical career, goes back to the Thai-Burma Railway, I think for the first time in 1987, then again in 1991. And about 1992, and he has not got long to live, he gets an invitation from 2 Canberra ANU, Australian National University academics, saying, we're putting together a symposium of former POWs and their captors in Canberra. Yeah. We would like you to come. You'll be with some former POWs, and we've even found a Korean guard that used to be on the Thai-Burma Railway with you. Yi Hak Nay, and Weary cannot believe it. Here he is, .3, carry 1, subtract 2, about 55, 57, 58 years later. The guy that he thought was dead is alive. And so he goes up to Canberra, and there is the one that he recognises. He's a very old man now, but it's the lizard. Yep. And Yi Hak Nay goes up to Weary, and Weary is sitting down at the time he enters the room. Weary himself is too weak to stand up quickly, and Yi Hak Nay offers him his hand, pulls him up, and then they go outside and they sit outside. Tom Uren's there, and Yi Hak Nay says, I have come to Australia to apologise to you. I want you to understand that the man I was at the age of 18, and I was only 18, and I'd been brought up in a land that was occupied by the Japanese. There's a translator doing this for them. Yeah. We had been brutalised. We had been told that the Japanese empire was everything, that you white men were less than scum, were lower than low. I had been, after the war was over, and so whatever I did there, I'm sorry for what I did, but I didn't know better. Yeah. I was condemned to death, but I did 20 years. I went back to Japan. I've read, I've talked, I've understand what I did back then was wrong, and I've come to Australia to apologise. And he offered his hand. Weary Dunlop shakes his hand and says, I understand. And I dealt with one of the professors that had organised that. Yeah. And Weary thereafter would refer to Yi Hak Nay the lizard as he asked the professor, how is my friend? And he was referring to Yi Hak Nay the lizard, the man he had nearly killed, murdered.
Peter FitzSimons, I think that ends this section of our talk, but the next bit is going to be about a crime, because you know we are a crime podcast, and I know that you know about a crime that indirectly involves Weary Dunlop, or in fact his best man and very good friend, a surgeon called Jim Yates. And I would suggest that to our listeners that next week Peter FitzSimons will give us his take on what is known as the needle in the heart murder. Thanks for talking to us today, Peter. Tell us about your book.
The book is The Courageous Life of Weary Dunlop. It's just out in late October 2025. I've been working on it for yonks, and I think of the recent books I've done, this is the one of which I am most proud, about the great Australian war hero and doctor and surgeon on the Thai-Burma Railway.
And lover.
He certainly
Weary
was.
Dunlop. And next week, our listeners will hear you talk about Jim Yates and Weary Dunlop, and one of the best technically unsolved murders I've ever heard of in Australian history.
Thank you, Andrew, for having me at your place. It's been an absolute pleasure. You've barely let me get a word in edgeways, but I enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening. Life and Crimes is a Sunday Herald Sun production for True Crime Australia. Our producer is Jonty Burton. For my columns, features and more, go to heraldsun.com.au/Andrew Rule, one word. For advertising inquiries, go to newspodcastssold.com. newspodcastssold@news.com.au. That is all one word, newspodcastssold. And if you want further information about this episode, links are in the description.